In December 1941, World War II came to the Pacific, with the attack on Pearl Harbor by forces of the Imperial Japanese Empire. America was in crisis. The Navy's battle fleet, devastated. The U.S. Army, understrength and poorly equipped. The Air Force, obsolete and inadequate. Meanwhile, Japanese territorial gains were increasing rapidly. America needed another 6 months to reorganize and reach full strength. But they didn't have another 6 months. The Japanese war machine had finally reached the Southwest Pacific. Allied aircraft spotted Japanese engineers building a new airfield on Guadalcanal in the Solomon Islands. This new airfield would seriously threaten Allied shipping lanes between America, Australia, and New Zealand. The Allies needed to act fast. A plan of attack was hastily prepared. For the first time in the Pacific War, combined Allied forces would attack and seize an enemy airfield and drive the Japanese from occupied territory. The 1st U.S. Marine Division had just arrived in Wellington, New Zealand. Allied Navy ships would soon transport them to the shores of Guadalcanal. These fresh, untested Marines had no idea of the fiery ordeal that awaited them.
Imagine our surprise when a milk wagon came along. We hadn't tasted fresh milk since we left the States, and boy, did it taste good. It wasn't long before our sergeant was bellowing, "Fall in," and we were off again, without even getting a good look at the town. We were heading for the railroad station. Here we did manage to get a gander at some rather odd-looking railway cars. These New Zealanders certainly did things right. When we got off the train, there was a band again, and we started our march to camp just like a big parade. We were out in the country, but of course, the usual kids were present to look us over and yell a few words of welcome. It was sort of nice, too. As we marched along that New Zealand road, I sort of wondered how long it would be before we marched through the streets of Tokyo. That is, if there's anything left of the place after we've had a crack at it. We didn't have much time to think about the future, though. Soon we were into camp. Then came the job of getting squared away. There was bound to be some gold-bricking, especially when one of the fellows brought out the galloping dominoes. Pretty soon our gear started to arrive, and then it was back to work again. Yep, and Old Glory was there too, flying proudly overhead. I guess there isn't anything any of us wouldn't do to keep it flying. And that goes for me too.
In August 1942, the convoy departed New Zealand, loaded with U.S. Marines, supplies, and equipment. Disembarking from their troop ships, the Marines quickly landed unopposed. They seized the airfield, readying it for the arrival of friendly aircraft. However, it was not American but Japanese aircraft that soon arrived. They attacked the Allied ships anchored in the placid waters off Guadalcanal. These attacks did little damage and cost the Japanese many downed planes and aircrew. but they succeeded in delaying the unloading of vital supplies. They also caused the covering U.S. Navy task force to depart after losing many fighter aircraft defending the convoy. Meanwhile, Japanese troops arrived by night and were determined to take back the airfield. On the island, the U.S. Marines prepared their defensive positions. On the seas surrounding Guadalcanal, ships of the Allied and Japanese navies met in close-quarter battles. Cruiser and destroyer clashes were often at night, which favored the experienced Japanese Navy with its deadly long lance torpedo. Dozens of Allied and far fewer enemy ships were lost. The watery graveyard around Guadalcanal soon became known as Iron Bottom Sound. The airfield, now called Henderson Field, received dozens of American fighter and bomber aircraft from U.S. Navy carriers offshore. These planes sortied from the airfield, attacking enemy shipping and aircraft from dawn to dusk. The Japanese dominated the sea at night. America ruled the air by day. Further out to sea, U.S. and Japanese carrier fleets launched aerial attacks against each other. In the skies above, furious air battles took place. Fighters struggled to protect their fleets. Below, many planes were shot down and ships of both navies took damage. Back on the island, aerial dogfights were fast, fierce, and frequent. Young, inexperienced U.S. flyers faced veteran Japanese pilots. Tough, tubby, American Wildcat fighters were up against the sleek, nimble Japanese Zero fighter, or the well-armed Betty bomber. Some pilots quickly became aces. Others got through on a wing and a prayer. some paid the ultimate price. During the day, the airfield suffered regular attacks from enemy planes. At night, Japanese ships bombarded the airfield from offshore. Around the airfield perimeter, the U.S. Marines held a tenuous grip. Desperate hand-to-hand fighting at night was common. Banzai charges were repeated again and again despite the huge loss to the Japanese attackers. At times the thin American defense line was broken only to be restored again, with great difficulty. Not many Japanese soldiers would be taken alive. Death in battle was honorable, but capture was shameful. American casualties were high too. Any Marines who had survived were either hungry, sick, or exhausted. Overall, the physical health and morale of the U.S. forces was at its lowest. As living conditions got worse and more Japanese troops arrived, the Allies began to doubt the outcome of their battle. Finally, in the midst of all these difficulties, it was sheer grit and determination that won the day. America and the Allies were gaining the victory, while their adversaries' losses mounted. The Japanese army were weak through battle casualties, malnutrition, and disease. Their navy and air forces were diminished by heavy losses in ships, planes, and personnel. The Japanese realized their cause was lost and suddenly evacuated Guadalcanal, by cover of night. The Allies had held on for 6 months and won their first territorial battle. New Allied resources, supplies, and reinforcements soon arrived. The tide was turning against Japan. With Japan on the defensive, the Allies were now advancing. 6 months of fighting in the air, at sea, and in the jungles of Guadalcanal were over. A struggle involving over 100,000 combatants had left more than 30,000 dead or wounded, 3/4 of whom were Japanese. Over 65 warships had been sunk and around 1,300 aircraft lost. The Japanese would never recover from the losses at Guadalcanal. On the other hand, the American and Allied war machine was at full steam and rolling towards inevitable victory. Today, a solemn memorial stands on the island engraved with these words. This memorial has been erected by the United States of America, in humble tribute to its sons and its allies, who paid the ultimate sacrifice for the liberation of the Solomon Islands, 1942 to 1943. In the fields and waters surrounding this memorial are relics and wreckage of war, to remind us that one of the major turning points of World War II was The Battle for Guadalcanal.